Okay, it should be recording.
Okay. So this presentation is going to be it's basically my third year lore paper. And it's looking at Egil Saga, I think that's how you pronounce it. And I went through, and whenever there was magic in the saga, and there's quite a bit of it, I went and I basically looked up all the terminology in the dictionary to see what term they were actually using. And that's basically the overview of this particular paper. And really, it seems like there are three categories. There's runes, which are pretty obvious. It mentions scythe just a little tiny bit. And then there are a whole bunch of words connected to the term Hamr, which means something like skin or caul or envelope, which is apparently the term for when your soul goes out of your body, or whatever word we're using. When it then takes on a kind of another body, and that's the Hamr, the animal. It's like a shape. And so a lot of the terminology in there is about that. And it seems connected not only to shape-shifting, but also to feats of enormous strength and berserkering. So let's see here. So, why isn't it going back? I want it to go back. There we are. So, Egil Saga is one of the most famous sagas, and one of the ones that's considered to be, have the greatest literary qualities. It's about Egil Skallagrimsson, who comes from this family of shapeshifters and berserkers. His grandfather, his name is Kveldolf, which means he changes into a wolf at night, presumably. His father, Skallagrim, is sort of super strong and has these berserker type abilities. And then he has all these sort of Odinic characteristics himself, Egil. He's very good with poetry. He knows rune magic. He's very strong, but it doesn't seem to be like berserkery strong. And he gets into a conflict with Eric Bloodaxe, basically the Norwegian and Yorkish king, and gets into a kind of a feud with them that is famously reconciled by a poem he writes during the course of the saga. So, like a lot of these sagas, it's multi-generational. Even though Egil is the main character, he doesn't show up for quite a while. It talks about his grandfather, Kveldolf, and his father, Skallagrim. And both of them every generation has brothers and other people in the family who are also interacting with the kings of Norway and usually coming off worse for it. There's a kind of a repeated motif between generations. So, I mean, one thing I guess we could ask about all of these is, why are we looking at these sagas? It's no secret that they're written centuries after the end of paganism and the Viking Age. And, a lot of people I know are very hostile to looking at Christianized sources. Even, Snorri Sturluson, who's basically our key into the entire mythology. People will complain about how he makes stuff up and he's too Christian and whatever. But, this is one of our, basically every window we have into the every written source we have that gives us a worldview into this, except for maybe the occasional runestone. It's all post-Christian. Even things like the Havamal people think there's a pretty heavy Christian influence in it as well. So we really don't have any uncompromised sources. And I also like to think of the sagas, they're almost like a kind of a shared universe of a science fiction author, a set of science fiction authors. There are a number of different people contributing to the genre, and they all have their own slightly different take on it. But when you put them together, they do make a fairly coherent picture of what Iceland was, what they imagined Iceland was like, and they have this kind of this image of what it was before Christianization. Now, a lot of that is, of course, an image that they're creating in conscious contradistinction to their Christianity. And so when they talk about magic or the old religion or any of these other things, there's a kind of a mix of both sort of condemnation and a kind of nostalgia to it. And of course, they're writing several hundred years later, and so we're not really sure that what the conception of the writers of the saga was the same as the conception of the people at the time. But in some ways, you can think of this as being really kind of the first reconstruction of the heathen Viking age, a kind of a literary reconstruction of what the people in Iceland in the Middle Ages thought or believed or wanted that period to be about. And there's a lot of information in the sagas that doesn't appear anywhere else, and the corpus is really large, so I don't think we can really just abandon it entirely. But it's important to recognize that when I talk about these categories and things, they don't necessarily correspond to what would have been practiced in a pre-Christian society or the exact worldview of a pre-Christian society. Although they're self-consistent enough, I suspect that it reflects some bits of that. So, okay, there's some bibliographical information. The translation I'm going to be using is the one from the big Sagas of the Icelander books that we use in the lore program. And I also used a kind of a student's reader edition for the text, although I've got the critical edition over here too. So, like I said, a lot of the magic in this is related to the word Hamr. And Hamr is, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's got a whole bunch of meanings. It seems to mean that sort of its root meaning is skin or hide or pelt. Sometimes you'll see in English they'll use the translation hame, which is basically the English equivalent, but nobody I know would know what hame is if you walked up and screamed it at them on the street. So, you know, it's basically an obsolete word in English. But it seems to have a kind of a secondary meaning of shape or form, particularly in animals' form. And it also can describe someone's like mental state, their mood or their mind. And so it's a really kind of ambiguous and flexible word, but it has all sorts of derivatives and uses in saga descriptions of magic, and particularly shape-shifting and berserker gang, basically. So one example of this is Egil's grandfather, Kveldolf. The name means something like evening wolf or night wolf. And you can see here, every day towards evening, he would grow so bad-tempered that few people dared even address him. He always went to sleep early in the evening and woke up early in the morning. People claimed that he was a shapeshifter, and they called him Kveldolf. And the word that's being used to mean shapeshifter is actually Hamramar. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. but it means basically strong in the Hamr. And it's not clear whether they thought of Kveldolf as actually physically changing into a wolf or sending out a kind of a soul projection while he was lying down, or maybe they didn't really make that much of a distinction. You can think about this. This is also a characteristic of Odin in the Icelandic Saga. It says Odin could change his appearance, and when he did so, his body would lie there as if he were asleep or dead. But he himself, in an instant, in the shape of a bird or an animal, a fish or a serpent, went to different distant countries on his or other men's errands. And we actually see another character in the saga do this. Queen Gunhild, Eric's wife, is a sort of notorious save worker, and we actually see her animal form at one point a little bit later. And Kveldolf is also basically a berserker. And at one point the family is leaving Norway and going to Iceland. And I'm trying to remember exactly how it happens, but there's like a fight with another ship or something. And Kveldolf goes into this frenzy and fights. And when he's done, he basically lies down exhausted and dies. And the saga remarks, it is said that people who could take on the character of animals or went berserk became so strong in this state that no one was a match for them, but also that just after it wore off, they were left weaker than usual. Kveldolf was the same, so that when his frenzy, Hamrimen, wore off, he felt exhausted by the effort he had made and was rendered completely powerless and had to lie down and rest. And you'll notice that it's using the word Hamramir and Berserksganger as essentially, it doesn't say they're exactly the same, but it indicates that they're both connected to this. And it's interesting to see the Berserksganger like directly paired up with the Hamr words. And Hamremi means something like the state of being Hamramr, more or less. Now, Kveldolf's son is Skallagrim. And Skallagrim, we don't ever see him change shape, but we do see him being really strong. And this is also described as a kind of a Hamr skill or Hamr magic. At one point, he is wrestling Egil when Egil is 12 and this other boy. And when it looks like Egil's about to win, Skallagrimr suddenly gets a lot stronger, and he like kills the other kid in this wrestling match and turns on Egil. And he has a foster mother who basically intervenes. And it describes her as, her name is Thorgerd Brock. And she was an imposing woman, as strong as a man and well-versed in the magic arts. Fjolkunning, which means like greatly knowledgeable. And she basically tells Skallagrim to knock it off. She says, "You're attacking your own son like a mad beast, Skallagrim." And if you look at the translation, the word that the translation is using to mean attacking your son like a mad beast is hamask, which means basically, I don't know, to go all hummery or to hummer at. And so the translator is putting the mad beast part into there as because of the associations of Hamr. And I'm trying to remember what happens. I think Skallagrim kills her instead of Egil, basically. And these attributes, being really strong, being sort of grumpy and stubborn, and having rages, these all apply to Egil too, the main character. In many ways, Egil is sort of paired against Queen Gunhild, who is Eric's queen. And at one important point in the saga, maybe the most famous part of the saga, Egil is out doing various Viking-y things, and his ship ends up landing in York, where Eric is king. And he realizes that Eric is going to find out that he's landed there. And so he basically decides he'll go and present himself at Eric's court rather than be discovered and captured and whatever. And it's said that this is, or it's strongly implied that this is the result of Gunhild's magic. It said that Gunhild had a magic rite, Seið, performed to curse Egil from ever finding peace in Iceland until she had seen him. So she's doing some kind of magic that's identified as Seið that is essentially drawing him to her or influencing his fate. I'm not exactly sure how you would take that, but she's making it so that he has to come see her. And Seidr is, of course, this hugely important word with a whole other complex of stuff around it. But that doesn't really show up a whole lot in Egil's saga. Now, Egil is then able to go into the hall and basically claim to be a guest. And so Eric can't really kill Egil right away. And so Egil is basically charged to make a poem, a praise poem for Eric. And he goes back to, I don't remember what it is, a house in town or his hotel or whatever, the Viking Motel 6. And while he's sitting there, he's having trouble writing his poem. And his friend asks him what's going on, and Egil says he hadn't composed a thing. A swallow has been sitting at the window, twittering all night, and I haven't had a moment's peace. Bjorn went out through the door that led to the roof. He sat down near the attic window where the bird had been sitting and saw a shapeshifter in the form of a bird leaving the other side of the house. Bjorn sat there all night until daybreak. Once Bjorn was there, Egil composed the whole poem and memorized it so that he could recite it to him when he met the king next morning. So the bird is implied to be, maybe they actually stated, I'm trying to remember, Gunhild in animal form messing with Egil so he won't be able to write this poem and save his life. And the term that they use, Hamrlepa, means something like Hammer leaper. I guess somebody who jumps into another state. So all these Hamr words are connected together. And the implication seems to be that there's a kind of a shape and body and soul magic that can let you, depending on how it manifests, do a number of different things. Project your spirit out as an animal, or even change yourself into an animal bodily, I guess, to give strength that's also associated with rages, and you get really tired after you do it if you're able to do this sort of thing. And we see some of that in Egil. It's sort of like with each generation, the abilities that the family has become sort of progressively more naturalistic until you get to Egil. The other big complex of words in this saga are about runes. Some of the most famous sort of rune magic in the saga is done by Egil. To give you an example, early on in the saga, Egil is drinking in this place, and they decide to poison his horn. Then Bard went up to the queen and told her that this man was bringing shame on them, always claiming to be thirsty no matter how much he drank. The queen and Bard mixed poison into the drink and brought it in. Bard made a sign over the draught and handed it to the serving woman, who took it to Egil and offered him a drink. Egil took out his knife and stabbed the palm of his hand with it, then took the drinking horn, carved runes on it, and smeared them with blood. And he spoke a verse. I carve runes on this horn, read in words with my blood. I choose words for the trees of the wild beasts' ear roots. Drink as we wish this mead brought by merry servants. Let us find out how we fare from the ale that Bard blessed. And the horn basically blows up when he does this and spills the drink all over the straw. of the floor. So if you look at the terminology associated with runes and sort of with Odinic magic in general, I think the most famous part of this is part of the Heimskringla, the section where it says basically, "Weißt du," or do you know, they, how, to do, verb in the infinitive, skal, which I think is like cognate to shall or should or something like that. So the terminology is all in the infinitives, sort of running down the middle of this column here. So associated with it in the Havamal are rista, which means carve, ratha, which means reed, fa'a, which means stain, and most people think it means stain with blood, which is something Egil does. Fresta is interpret, bithya is bid, Bolota is sacrifice, Cinda is sinned, like I guess sending a ghost or a minion or something. And Soa, we're not entirely sure what that means. It might mean sacrifice again, although this source translates it as destroy. And I've seen it translated different ways. And the Havamal, this section of the Havamal, seems to be a kind of a initiation into various kinds of magic. And so it's interesting that these words are repeated in the description of what Egil does here. So he carves the runes on the horn, and he reddens them with his blood. Reist al runar al koreth al blotinu. So the terminology is basically echoing this sort of terminology from the Havamal. The other thing that I think is interesting is it doesn't say what runes he carves into it. And he says this verse at the same time. One of Egil's characteristics is that he's able to compose poetry, often spontaneously, that's very impressive and may in fact be itself magical, is sort of my theory of it. And when people talk about doing rune magic and Galdr nowadays, sort of modern heathen practitioners, the thing they usually do is they usually figure out what runes have the associations they want, and then they like kind of sing or yodel them to activate them. And my suspicion is that when these sagas and other accounts of the runes talk about someone carving a spell and then saying Galdr, my suspicion is that the Galdr is not just saying the rune names, but probably doing some other kind of incantation that's more complex that we don't have. And part of the reason I'm sort of leaning in that direction is because of the later sort of late medieval, early modern Galdr books in Iceland have a number of written symbols accompanied by really complicated, in some cases, or not so complicated, poems, but none of them are ever really just saying the rune name alone, or maybe one or two of them are. In this, Egil also does sort of the most famous act of magic maybe in the saga literature, and that's the Nithstang, or the curse pole that he makes. He's in this kind of this feud with Eric and his wife, and he goes to Norway and he makes this object that curses the king and the queen. He took a hazel pole in his hand and went to the edge of a rock facing inland. Then he took a horse's head and put it on the end of the pole. Afterwards, he made an invocation for Mala, which I think is basically cognate with formula, saying, "Here I set up this scorn pole, Nithstang, to turn its scorn, Nithi, upon King Eirik and Queen Gunhild, and then turn the horse's head to face land. And I turn its scorn upon the nature spirits, Landvættir, that inhabit the land, sending them all astray so that none of them will find its resting place by chance or design until they have driven King Eric and Gunhild from this land. Then he thrust the pole into a cleft in the rock and left it stand there. He turned the head towards the land and carved Rest Rune, the whole invocation in runes, onto the pole. And this does, in fact, the saga, I guess, implies, drive Eric and Gunhild out of Norway, which is how they end up in York, where the poem sequence happens. The horse and the horse head, I think, is, you see a lot of sacred horses in Germanic religion, and I think this is a kind of an inverse of that being used for hostile magic, and it might represent in some ways a kind of a Christian motif. I'm sure that most of these things that Egil does, I think that the audience, even though he's the hero, I think the audience is supposed to find them at least slightly creepy and scary, and not the sort of thing people are supposed to do. Egil also does some stuff with runes in another verse. It's kind of when he gets back to Iceland, it's kind of towards the end of things, the saga. And he finds a woman who is lying in bed sick. And he finds like a stick or something with runes carved on it. And, oh, it's a whalebone. And he says basically they did this wrong. It was, I think, supposed to be like a love letter, and instead it like cursed this woman. So he ordered them to lift her out of the bed and place clean sheets underneath her. And this was done. Then he examined the bed she had been lying in and found a whalebone with runes carved on it. After reading the runes, Egil shaved them off and scraped them into the fire. He burned the whalebone and had her bedclothes aired. So he's essentially disrupting or counterspelling, or whatever you want to say, the magic by scraping off the magically operative words. He's burning the medium it was delivered in, and he's having the bedclothes cleansed. And then he says, no man should carve runes unless he can read them well. Many a man goes astray around those dark letters. On the whalebone I saw 10 secret letters carved. From them the linden tree took her long harm. And he cuts some different runes and sticks them back under the pillow, and she gets better. So he indicates that he's better at runes than this other guy, and also that runes can potentially misfire and hurt people. And you'll notice also he's doing a poem as part of this that's not the same as what's written on the runes. Written in rune staves on the object. And I guess the final question I kind of have about this is the poetry that he does, the spontaneous poetry. That's a very Odinic kind of gift, and it fits in with the runes and the other kinds of inspirations that he has really quite well. And so I wonder whether even Egil's mundane poems, or we would consider non-magical, are coming out of these same gifts and maybe also being magically operative in some way. But that's the combination of terms that's being used in this particular saga for the magic that Egil does and Queen Gunhild does, and that we see show up in it. Okay, how do I go back to this guy? No, that's not it. How do you exit full screen mode? There we are. Okay. Any questions or comments or anything? No, that's it? Okay.
Sorry, I'm in the background here. I'm listening though. So when to what effect would you, to what degree would you commingle this Hamr magic with Saith, because you know, as I did a paper on Saith, one of the things the Saith workers do is send their animal fetch, or whatever you want to call it, out to surveillance people. And we've seen in other sagas, like Hrothgar saga, where one person changes into a bear or projects his bear fetch out to fight. So I think you personally refer to it as a type of soul magic. You know, so is Hamr a type of Saith, or is it?
Yeah, I would think so. I think there's a lot of overlap between Saith and Hamr. And Hamr isn't really a type of magic. The term doesn't mean a type of magic. It basically means the shape that's being produced by magic. And so all these derivative terms, I think it's quite possible that all of this stuff, to some degree, is Sather or overlaps with Sather. The Sather stuff usually involves some kind of chanting, and the high seat, it tends to be associated with the Finns or the Sami, and it tends to be something that people who are not terribly reputable do. And the people who do the Hamr stuff, who turn into wolves or bears or whatever, or berserk, especially the berserkers, don't necessarily have the whole complex of Sather abilities, particularly the berserkers. So I think there's some kind of overlapping category there. Although it must be said, some of the characters in this do have a kind of prophecy capability. I'm trying to remember. It's Skala Grimson gets given an axe by his son. It was a gift to the son from the king, and I think it's Skala Grim. He says this. He says, "I don't think this is going to work out and be very lucky." And he puts the axe up in his house, and one time he takes it down and it falls apart, which seems to be a kind of a prophetic echo of what's going to happen to his son, who has bad things happen to him in Norway. Or maybe it's Skala Grimson and Kveldolfr. It's been a while since I read it, but it's one of the generations that runs afoul of the king. So yeah. The other thing about this is, you know, we look at this and we try to reconstruct from these terms, and we think that maybe it seems to me that a lot of people think there's some kind of really complex system of theology and magic with a bunch of intricate, self-consistent terminology, you know, a kind of a Thomas Aquinas of magic in the heathen age, where all these terms have a distinct meaning from each other and everybody recognizes them. And I don't think that's probably true. I think that these words are kind of poetic, and they represent a kind of a spectrum of possible meanings, and that they don't necessarily come together into a kind of a systematic whole necessarily. That there's the same kind of imprecision with a lot of these terms that we have when we talk about, I don't know, ghosts in English or whatever. I mean, is there an exact distinction between a technical distinction in English popular culture between a ghost, a spirit, a revenant, and a haunting? Not really. They all kind of do the same sort of thing. So I think something like that's probably going on with the original terminology too.
Have you checked with the Freya? She has the bird. Is it a costume? What is it in English when people take on to become birds?
The cloak?
Yeah, it's in Danish. It's always called fugleham, the bird hammer.
Ah, that's interesting.
And I don't know how it is, no Norse, but when you use ham in Danish, it might be the same, no Norse.
Yeah.
Maybe hammers use that too.
I think that Freya's magic cloak that changes her into a bird or allows her to fly, I can't remember exactly which one it is probably a kind of a different kind of expression of the same underlying beliefs in soul projection and animal transformation and that whole complex of magic, but it's kind of on a more elevated, sort of more mythic level when you talk about Freya, and has become concretized into an object, if that makes any sense.
Danish,
And you do see objects associated with berserkers, like belts and
You pooped this morning?
the word in the hammer, in Danish is the top layer of the skin.
Okay.
And when in Tolkien, when the bear on the bear, he's a
Yeah.
hamskifter, game changer in Danish.
Yeah.
So the word is also used today.
And I think that's probably because Tolkien read this stuff and he knew the word and the concepts and everything.
But it's skin changer in English.
Put them in there, yeah.
It's only in the Danish version they use the word ham.
Yeah. There is an English cognate with it that's really obscure. So, yeah. And this sort of, all of these ideas about spirit projection and shape changing and cursing and so forth are all kind of, I don't know what you say, kind of floating around in the background of the sagas and the other Germanic sources. And they're very evocative, but they're real hard to pin down.
I'm also I'm not really into all that rune thing.
All the what?
The rune things. The rune magic thing.
Rune magic, yeah.
You can understand this guy's content.
I haven't read it recently, that saga. I re-listened to it in an audiobook recently.
Yeah.
And I think more than one place it says, you know, the Nidstand thing you read, it says the whole invocation in runes.
Yeah.
So it's most possible that when they did magic with runes, they wrote an invocation like, we find invocation in runes on different objects, especially lead objects. So why isn't it reasonable to think that all the rune magic is people writing an invocation down and not the names of runes?
There's a good book, I'm trying to remember the bibliography of it, about a survey of all the magical amulets that they found with runic inscriptions.
MacLeod and Meese?
Yes, and the stuff that's on those amulets doesn't really look a whole lot like what people are doing today. I think what people are doing today is, for divination, is obviously just, it's tarot with the serial numbers filed off. And when it comes to making bind runes where the symbols combine to mean something, I think there was some of that going on, but not a whole lot. But if you look at the actual historical amulets there, they do things like they say, leak, leak, leak over, L-E-E-K.
Or Aloo.
Yeah, exactly. And they seem to spell out these magical phrases, and there's some indication that they're carving the rune because of its name, and kind of like people do today. But I get the impression that the historical practice was quite a bit different than practice that we do today, and was probably a lot just quirkier. The people who are doing this stuff today seem to be taking the rune set, the Elder Futhark, as a kind of a self-consistent logical system designed for divination and magic, and are then sort of trying to figure out its parameters. But I suspect that the actual historical magic was people memorizing various kinds of phrases and things and writing them down to do particular things without necessarily there being this complicated theory behind it. And also you have to recognize that as far as modern rune practice goes, pretty much everybody uses the Elder Futhark, which is Proto-Germanic. And by the time you get to the sagas and the Viking Age, they've dropped, 8 of the characters, and they're using the Younger Futhark, which is, the names are different, slightly different, they're pronounced differently, and they've gone through the morphological transformations associated with the change in language from Proto-Germanic to Norse or whatever. And so there are fewer of them, and they're different than the ones everybody uses with the Elder Futhark. And my suspicion is that people like the Elder Futhark because that was what was done by Bloom, and it's got more characters in it, so your divination can tell you more things. And they kind of avoid the Anglo-Saxon Futhark because, you know, the Anglo-Saxon stuff seems specific to Anglo-Saxon, whereas the Elder Futhar can kind of be claimed by anybody who wants to do anything Germanic. I don't know. That's just my rant. Sorry.
I think they use the Elder Futhar because they think that it was runes in the Tacitus quote.
Yeah, the Tacitus quote does a lot too.
And
I know people
were invented at that time. We don't know if runes were invented when Tacitus wrote, but if they were invented, it had to be Elder Futhar.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say so anywhere.
Yeah, he just says they take these sticks basically and do something with them.
But I think when I read the sagas, many curses I see, that's people saying you shall not have intercourse with that woman, and then his private parts get bigger when they get closer. So I think that the curses that they mention in runes are probably also along what's called the same thing just written.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, the whalebone with the runes on it that Egil finds under the woman is basically somebody's attempted love spell. And if you look at the Mediterranean world and their Defixiones tablets and so forth, it was very common to write out an inscription on like lead or something, and then you would bury it under somebody's threshold or sneak it into their house somehow, and that was supposed to affect them. So I think something like that is going on there too.
Yeah, I just think they spelled it wrong, and the spell then backfired somehow.
Yeah, you spelled it wrong or something.
You have to spell it right.
Yeah, you have to know what you're doing, apparently.
And what that story suggests is that on some level there's an objective truth to the runes. There's a concrete reality rather than some New Age authors who say the runes are whatever you want them to be.
Although if you look at it in the terms of the story, I think that the incident is designed to show Egil's superior knowledge compared to other people at the time, because he kind of parachutes in and fixes everything, and he knows how to really do it, whereas other people don't. And I think that's part of sort of elevating Egil's stature. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not also true that they conceived of it as having an objective sense. I do think the way they would think about runes and rune magic would be quite a bit different than the way we do today. I think there would be more of them simply memorizing particular sequences and believing that they had a particular effect without, trying to create new things based on the intention and the spelling and everything. I think there was probably a lot more quirky, like memorization involved than we do. And that would be exactly the same thing that would disappear since there's no real oral tradition or anything about this, and would be basically impossible to recover.
The only other thing I wanted to mention, Thom, is I think you're on the right track when you mentioned that poetry is itself proceeds from Odinic magic or as a form of, because if we look at the Celtic tradition, poetry is intrinsic magic in that tradition.
Yeah.
Some of the most powerful spells, if you were, are composing scathing reviews of the reigning queen or the reigning lord.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the skalds are not entirely appreciated as a form of magic, especially since Woden is the god of wood, the god of poetic inspiration. Some people don't seem to focus on that enough, apparently.
Yeah, and it's like when I talked about Viga Gloom Saga. All of the sagas have this really or a lot of them have this really interesting thing going on, where the supernatural is almost sublimated into the natural, and there are incidents that you see that appear on the surface to be entirely naturalistic, that as you think about them might be foretellings or magic, or maybe not. Maybe they're just a literary device like foreshadowing, like a lot of people talk about in Njaal's saga. What's his name? Gunnar gets on his horse to go down to the ship to leave Iceland on exile. And I think it's his, I'm trying to remember if this is right. His horse stumbles and he happens to look backwards and he sees the land behind him and he says how beautiful the slopes are. And he decides he's not going to leave Iceland and he goes back to his house. And this eventually gets him killed. And so is that a fated occurrence? Is that a supernatural intercession into the natural order of things, makes his horse do whatever? Or is it a literary device that's doing foreshadowing, or is it kind of a little bit of both? Okay, well, guess that's about it for this one. Why don't we turn off the recording and I'll answer any general lore program questions you got, and